She's too slow for the mosque. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't even said directly to me. It came out in that careless mutter of youth, the kind of half-whisper you don't expect anyone to really hear. But I did. And once I heard it, the words lodged themselves somewhere inside me, sharp and unwilling to dissolve. I was sitting on the edge of the bed that morning, the sun already slanting in through the curtains, painting strips of gold across the faded rug. My shoes were neatly placed side by side, polished the night before as I had always done on Eid Eve. It's a habit that came from my own father, who would tell us that shoes carried you into the new year of faith, and they should step into it with dignity. My hands trembled a little now as I bent to tie the laces, fingers no longer as quick as they once were. Age has a way of making even small tasks feel monumental. But I tied them carefully, double knotting like I had taught my children decades ago. The house was alive with the usual Eid chaos, children running from room to room, laughter spilling out, the smell of sweet vermicelli boiling with milk, and meat marinated in spices waiting to be grilled later. It should have been one of those mornings where I felt wrapped in love, swallowed by the noise of family. Yet in the middle of all that joy, his words cut a quiet space where I suddenly felt alone. My grandson, my daughter's boy, only 16, had said it to his older brother while pulling on his crisp white kurta. His voice carried the impatience of someone eager to get going, someone who believed the mosque was waiting for him, that punctuality mattered more than patience. She's too slow for the mosque. He didn't look at me when he said it, but I saw the roll of his eyes, the subtle tilt of his head toward me, like I was a burden too heavy for his young enthusiasm. I didn't correct him. I didn't clear my throat to make my presence known. Instead, I tied the last loop of my lace, stood slowly, and walked into the hallway. My lips pressed against his cheek in a quick kiss, the way I always did, though I don't think he registered it. His face twitched in surprise, maybe even slight discomfort, and he wiped it casually with his sleeve as though my affection were too wet, too old-fashioned. I told myself I didn't mind. I told myself it was just how boys are at that age. But in truth, I minded very much. I lingered near the mirror in the corridor, adjusting the scarf draped loosely around my shoulders. My reflection startled me, as it often did these days. The woman looking back was older than the one I felt inside. There were deep creases around my eyes, lines etched from years of smiling, worrying, praying, and waiting. My scarf slipped down, and I pulled it tighter. For a moment I thought about not going to the mosque at all. Perhaps I could pray at home. Perhaps my presence wasn't needed there anymore. But then another memory surged, my husband, may Allah bless his soul, taking my hand every Eid morning, telling me, the mosque is where we meet God together. No one is too slow for him. He had been gone 12 years, but his words still had weight. So I straightened my back, picked up my walking stick, and decided I would go, whether or not anyone thought I was fast enough. The car ride was crowded. My daughter sat in the front beside her husband, her eyes already scanning her phone as messages from friends poured in. In the back, the children jostled for space. I tacked myself into the corner, feeling the stiffness in my knees as the seatbelt pressed across me. Nobody offered me the window seat, though I had always loved watching the familiar streets of my neighborhood. Instead, I stared at the back of the driver's seat, listening to the hum of excitement around me. The mosque was only 15 minutes away, but in that small span of time I drifted somewhere else. I thought about the Eids of my youth, the long walks through narrow village lanes, neighbors calling out greetings, the way the entire community moved like one body toward prayer. I remembered carrying my eldest daughter on my hip, her tiny hands clutching my scarf as I balanced her while trying to keep pace with my husband's long strides. I had never been too slow then. I had been strong, steady, necessary. When we arrived, the parking lot was already full. Families poured out of their cars, women in colorful clothes, men in pressed white kurtas, children darting ahead. My grandson bolted forward with his brother, leaving me behind without a glance. My daughter, distracted by making sure her youngest's cap stayed on, didn't notice I was still struggling to open the car door. It was a stranger who finally held it open for me, a man I didn't know, who smiled politely and stepped aside. I thanked him softly and shuffled forward, adjusting the scarf around my head. Inside the mosque courtyard, the ground was uneven, scattered with pebbles. Each step felt deliberate, careful. The crowd surged past me like a river around a stone. I felt their energy, their eagerness, and my slowness became more pronounced. My stick tapped against the stone, steady but unhurried. My heart ached, not from exertion, but from the realization that I was invisible in a place where I had once been central. When I finally reached the women's section, most had already spread their prayer mats. The room buzzed with chatter, the sweet sound of reunion. Cousins embracing, neighbors calling out greetings. I found a small space in the corner and slowly lowered myself down, my knees stiff with protest. As I placed my mat, I caught the faint echo of my grandson's words in my mind, like a thread unraveling in the background of all this joy. "She's too slow for the mosque." Prayer began. The imam's voice filled the hall, steady, melodic. As I bowed, rose, and bent again, my body protested, but my soul felt an ease I hadn't known in a long time. Here, in these movements, I was no slower than anyone else. Each bow was a surrender, each prostration a reunion. In that rhythm, I was equal again. But when it ended, and the families surged out, laughter spilling into the courtyard, I once more felt the divide. My children hurried ahead to greet friends, my grandchildren ran to find their cousins, and I was left folding my mat alone. A young girl I didn't know offered me a smile, the kind that held no judgment, just kindness, and it almost undid me. We gathered again by the car, but by then the moment had cemented itself. I wasn't angry at my grandson. I wasn't even angry at my daughter for not noticing. What I felt was heavier, more complicated, a grief that I had somehow shifted from being essential to being excess. That night, after the meat had been eaten, after the laughter had quieted and the dishes washed, I sat by the window alone. The street was quiet, children's lanterns dimmed, the smell of grilled lamb lingering faintly. I watched the shadows of neighbors moving behind curtains, and I thought about my own shadow, smaller now, slower, yet still here. And it was then that I whispered to myself, almost like a vow, I would not let those words define the rest of my days. If they thought I was too slow, then perhaps I needed to show them there was more to me than the pace of my steps. What that meant, I did not yet know. But I felt the stirring of something, faint but undeniable, as though the world was quietly reminding me that my story was not finished. The day after Eid always carries a different weight. The anticipation has passed, the house is still scattered with reminders of celebration, wrapping paper crumpled under the table, sweet dishes half finished in the fridge, the faint smell of incense clinging to the curtains. Yet underneath all that, there is a quietness, as though the house itself exhales after holding its breath through days of preparation and festivity. I woke earlier than usual that morning. My body has its own rhythm now, sleep comes in patches, often restless, broken by the shifting aches in my knees and back. Dawn seeped in through the curtains, soft and pale, not yet the harsh sun that would come later. For a moment I lay still, listening. The house was hushed, only the faint buzz of the ceiling fan overhead. I could hear the distant crow of a rooster, though we lived far from the village where such sounds once woke me daily. My mind returned, uninvited, to the words that had unsettled me the day before. "She's too slow for the mosque." It seemed absurd, in a way, that a simple mutter could linger longer than the imam's sermon, longer than the shared laughter over sweets, longer than the warm greetings of neighbors. But the heart holds on to bruises more stubbornly than blessings, and mine was no exception. I rose, moving carefully so as not to disturb my daughter who was still asleep in the next room. My feet touched the cool tiles, and I felt the stiffness immediately, that reminder of years piled one atop another. Still, I stood. Still, I moved. I washed, tied my scarf, and spread my prayer mat in the living room. As I bent and rose in the quiet, with no one to measure my pace, I thought about slowness differently. Alone, it was not a flaw. Alone, it was deliberate. Each movement stretched into something almost meditative. Perhaps my grandson would never understand that, perhaps the young only measure time and speed, not depth. When the house eventually stirred to life, the clatter of dishes and voices replaced the silence. My daughter entered, yawning, her hair tied hastily back. Amy, you're up early, she said, surprised. I only smiled. I didn't tell her that the weight of unspoken words had pushed me from sleep. Later, as we sat at the table, the children tumbled in, each absorbed in their own worlds. My grandson, the same one whose careless remark had unsettled me, slid into a chair, scrolling through his phone without so much as a greeting. His face, sharp with youth, showed no trace of awareness. For him, yesterday's mutter had vanished into the ether. But for me, it clung still, invisible yet heavy. I studied him quietly, trying to remember him as a child. The boy who once clutched my hand to cross the street, who once demanded stories before bed, who once rested his head against my lap while drifting into sleep. Where had that boy gone? In his place sat someone taller, busier, impatient, someone I could not quite reach. And yet, I loved him still, fiercely. Love does not evaporate with neglect, it only aches differently. That day, after breakfast, my daughter suggested we all walk to the park. The younger children jumped with excitement, but I felt hesitation coil inside me. The park was not far, yet the walk was long enough to test my knees. I opened my mouth to decline, but then stopped. Declining would only confirm what my grandson believed, that I was too slow, too fragile, too much effort to bring along. So I nodded instead, and reached for my stick. The sun was already warming the streets when we stepped outside. The neighborhood bustled with posted calm, shopkeepers sweeping, women exchanging greetings at their gates, the smell of fried dough still drifting faintly from a stall. My grandchildren darted ahead, their laughter carried on the breeze. I trailed behind with my daughter, each step deliberate, my stick tapping against the pavement. The park was crowded, as expected. Families picnicked on blankets, children chased kites, young men played cricket on the worn grass. My grandchildren scattered like birds, vanishing into the chaos. My daughter hurried after the youngest, leaving me to find a bench on my own. I moved slowly, deliberately, until I found one shaded by a neem tree. Lowering myself onto it, I felt the cool wood against my palms, grounding me. From there I watched. I watched children squeal with delight, their voices sharp as bells. I watched young mothers gossip, their bangles clinking as they gestured. I watched my own family in fragments, my grandson tossing a ball, his laughter unguarded, his youth radiant. And as I watched, I thought again of invisibility. It is a strange thing, to be surrounded by people yet feel unseen. In my youth, I had filled spaces, my presence mattered, my voice carried weight, my hands were busy and necessary. Now, I sat on a bench like part of the scenery. No one was unkind. They simply did not notice. It was then that an old woman approached. She was bent slightly, her hair streaked with silver, her face creased with the map of years. She smiled as she lowered herself beside me. "Hot day," she said simply. I nodded. Hot, yes. We sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the park unfold before us. Then she spoke again. "Your family?" she asked, gesturing toward my grandchildren. "Yes," I said softly. "Yours?" She shook her head. "Mine are grown. They live abroad now. I come here sometimes, just to watch the young. It reminds me I'm still part of it all." Her words touched something in me. She too was alone in a crowd, yet she found a way to belong simply by watching. Perhaps belonging did not always mean being at the center. Perhaps it sometimes meant quietly bearing witness. When my daughter returned to collect me, I rose slowly, thanking the woman with a nod. She smiled again, her eyes kind, and for the first time since that careless mutter, I felt a faint thread of reassurance. That evening, as the house grew lively again with visitors, I excused myself early. I retreated to my room, lit a small lamp, and opened the old wooden chest at the foot of my bed. Inside were relics of my life, letters yellowed with age, photographs curled at the edges, my husband's watch, my children's baby clothes folded into soft bundles. I lifted one photograph, my husband standing proudly in front of the mosque, our children crowded around him, me at his side. I studied the faces, the smiles, the sense of togetherness. We had been whole then. I wondered if they remembered those days as vividly as I did. I closed the chest, but the stirring inside me grew louder. My life had narrowed into routines of waiting for visits, waiting for calls, waiting for invitations. And in that waiting, I had allowed myself to shrink. My grandson's words had simply illuminated what had long been true. That night, as I sat by the window once more, I made a quiet decision. If I was too slow for the mosque, then perhaps I would find another path, not of speed, but of purpose. Something that would remind both me and them that I was still here, still capable of shaping days, not merely enduring them. What that path would be, I did not yet know. But I felt its outline forming, faint but certain. Perhaps it would begin with something small, a walk alone, a visit to the market, a conversation with neighbors. Small acts that said, I exist, I matter, I am more than the pace of my steps. And in that resolve, a curious warmth filled me. A seed, perhaps, that had waited too long for soil. The days after Eid unfolded slowly, but something within me had shifted. It wasn't dramatic, no one else could have noticed it. But inside, I was no longer content to sit quietly in the corners of life, waiting to be carried along. My grandson's words had stung, yes, but they had also lit a fire I had not felt in years, a stubbornness, almost, that told me I must remind myself, if not everyone else, that I was still here. The first step was simple. I decided to go to the market alone. It had been years since I had gone without company. My daughter usually insisted on bringing me what I needed, and I had let her. Convenience had slowly become dependency, and dependency had disguised itself as love. But that morning, after the house emptied with the children off to school and my son-in-law to work, I tied my scarf firmly, picked up my stick, and stepped out into the street. The air carried the mingled scents of spices and dust. Shops were opening, shutters clattering upward, and the road pulsed with rickshaws, bicycles, and chatter. I walked slowly, yes, but I walked with intention. Each step felt both fragile and powerful, as though I was reintroducing myself to the world. Some shopkeepers recognized me and greeted me warmly, surprised to see me after so long. Their smiles gave me strength. At the spice stall, I bought cardamom and cinnamon, their scents pulling me into memories of cooking feasts for my children when they were small. At the fruit seller's cart, I selected mangoes myself, pressing them gently the way my mother once taught me. The vendor grinned. "Appa, you still know the good ones," he said. His words, casual and kind, filled me with quiet pride. By the time I returned home, my knees ached, but my heart was lighter. My daughter was startled to find me unpacking groceries. "Ammi, you should have called me," she exclaimed, half worried, half scolding. I only smiled. "I wanted to walk," I said. She frowned, but I saw the flicker of something else in her eyes, recognition, perhaps, that I was still capable of more than she assumed. The second step came a few days later. I went to visit my old friend, Aisha, who lived 3 streets away. We had once spoken daily, but over the years our conversations had thinned, lost beneath the weight of routine. That morning, I wrapped a small box of sweets, leaned on my stick, and set out. When Aisha opened the door, her face lit up in astonishment. "You came yourself?" she said, pulling me into an embrace. We spent hours together, sipping tea, exchanging stories, laughing in the way only old friends can. There was something healing in her presence, as though I had stepped back into a version of myself that had not been diminished by years or dismissals. Before I left, she squeezed my hand. "Don't wait so long next time," she said. "We are not so slow that the world can leave us behind." Her words echoed as I walked home. We are not so slow. Perhaps slowness was only another way of saying steady. Perhaps it was not weakness, but another rhythm altogether. The third step came unexpectedly. At the mosque that Friday, I arrived early, determined not to lag behind the rush. As I laid my mat, a young mother beside me struggled with her toddler, who squirmed and tugged at her scarf. Without thinking, I reached out, gathering the child gently into my lap. The boy settled against me almost instantly, his tiny hand resting on mine. The mother looked at me with relief, whispering thanks. Through the prayer, the child remained calm, and when I returned him afterward, the woman clasped my hands. "You have such patience," she said. Patience. That was the word. Not slowness, not weakness, patience. When I returned home that afternoon, my grandson barely glanced up from his phone. But I didn't need his notice in that moment. Something had changed in me. I no longer measured myself by his careless mutter. I was discovering a new way to measure, in steps taken alone, in visits reclaimed, in kindness quietly offered. Still, the ache of his words lingered. At night, as I lay awake, I replayed them, wondering if he even remembered saying them. To him, they were nothing. To me, they had become a mirror. But perhaps that was the strange gift of hurtful words, they forced you to look at yourself differently, to ask questions you had avoided. I began keeping a small notebook on my bedside table, jotting down each day one thing I had done for myself. Some days it was as simple as walking to the corner shop. Other days it was calling an old acquaintance, or reading a chapter of a book I had left half-finished. These small records became proof that I was still moving forward, not back. And slowly, I realized something. It was not only about me proving myself to my family. It was about proving myself to me. For too long, I had let others' rhythms dictate mine. But I was not done. My story, though slower perhaps, still had chapters left to write. One evening, as the sun sank low and the call to prayer rose, I stood at the window and whispered into the air, "I am not too slow for God. I am not too slow for life." My voice was soft, but steady. And in that moment, I believed it. It was a week after my quiet vow to myself when the real test came. My daughter had planned a family outing to a cousin's house in the next town. The car was already crowded before I even stepped into the hallway. Children jostled with their bags, voices calling out, the rush of excitement filling the air. "Amy, maybe you should stay back today," my daughter said gently, almost as if she were asking a favor rather than suggesting it. "It's a long drive, and I know it will be tiring for you. We'll be back by evening." Her words were careful, but they struck me in the same place my grandsons had. Stay back. Rest. Too slow, too tired, too much. For a moment, I nearly agreed. The thought of sitting alone in the house, however, while they drove off with laughter spilling out the windows, was unbearable. "No," I said simply. "I'm coming." My daughter hesitated, then nodded. "Of course, Amy," she said quickly, but her eyes flickered with worry that I would slow them down, that I would be a burden. I felt it, and I refused to let it define me. The ride was long, yes, and the road uneven, but I sat straight, my hands folded in my lap. I watched the scenery roll by, the fields stretching into the horizon, the goats grazing lazily, the trees swaying in the warm breeze. Each passing mile reminded me of journeys I had taken before, when I was the one leading, carrying food in baskets, singing songs to keep the children occupied. I had not always been the one left behind. When we arrived, the house was alive with commotion. Relatives poured out to greet us, laughter spilling into the courtyard, the smell of freshly cooked biryani heavy in the air. My cousins, older now themselves, enveloped me in hugs. "It has been too long," one of them said, her eyes shining with sincerity. And in that moment, I felt seen. Not as an afterthought, not as someone too slow, but as a guest of honor. The afternoon unfolded in a blur of conversation and food. I sat among my cousins, sharing memories, trading stories. My grandchildren darted in and out, playing with their cousins, their laughter weaving through the rooms. At one point, my grandson, the very one who had wounded me with his words, came to sit beside me. He didn't say much, but he rested for a while, sipping juice, quiet and thoughtful. I did not press him. Sometimes presence is enough. Later, when the family gathered for tea in the courtyard, the chairs filled quickly. My daughter, balancing plates, glanced around and called, "Amy, sit here." She offered me her own seat, insisting she would stand. For a moment I resisted. After all, I had walked, traveled, sat without complaint. But then I accepted, not because I was weak, but because I realized that strength does not always mean refusing help. Sometimes it means knowing you're worth enough to receive it without shame. The ride home that evening was quieter. The children slept in the back seat, my daughter leaned against her husband, and I sat watching the road, dark now except for the headlights carving through it. I thought about how small victories are sometimes invisible to others. My daughter might never realize what it had taken for me to insist on going, to sit among my cousins, to reclaim my place in that gathering. But I knew. And that knowledge was enough. In the days that followed, something subtle shifted in the household. My daughter no longer assumed I would stay behind. She asked instead, "Amy, do you want to come?" That small change in language mattered more than she knew. It gave me a choice, a voice, where before there had only been gentle dismissal. As for my grandson, I noticed him watching me sometimes. Not directly, not in any way that demanded acknowledgement, but in the quiet way of teenagers whose minds are still learning to hold contradictions. Perhaps he was beginning to see that I was more than slow steps. Perhaps he was beginning to understand that love is not measured in speed. One evening, as we all gathered in the living room, I felt a sudden urge to share something. The children were talking about their futures, universities, travels, dreams. I cleared my throat softly, and they looked at me. "When I was your age," I began, "I dreamed of being a teacher. Life had other plans, but do you know, even now, I still teach?" They looked puzzled, so I explained. "Every time I show you how to cook a dish, every time I tell you a story of the past, every time I remind you to greet your elders with respect, that is teaching. It does not stop because one grows older. It continues, if you choose to see it." My words hung in the room, soft but steady. My grandson shifted slightly, and for the first time in weeks, he met my eyes. Just for a moment, but it was enough. That night, as I folded my scarf and placed it neatly on the chair, I thought about all the ways my life was still unfolding. I was not finished. My story was still being written, in small choices, in quiet insistences, in words that carried not bitterness but resilience. And I realized then that the sting of being called too slow had given me a gift. It had forced me to walk at my own pace, not in shame, but in strength. The real shift came on a Friday afternoon, 2 weeks after the Eid that had unsettled me so deeply. My daughter had asked if I would stay home while she took the children to the mosque. Her tone was soft, as though she wanted to spare me the effort. I almost agreed, habit still tugged at me to yield, but something inside me flared. "No," I said, firmer than I intended. "I will go." She looked startled, then nodded quickly. "Of course, Amy." The drive was quiet, my grandson slouched in the back seat, earphones in, eyes fixed on the world outside. I studied his profile, trying to see the boy I once knew in the teenager he had become. I wondered if he remembered the afternoons I walked him to school, the times I waited by the gate until he returned. Memory, I realized, is a strange thing. What feels like a lifetime's devotion to one person may register as only fragments to another. When we reached the mosque, the courtyard was busier than usual. It was crowded, the air thick with heat and anticipation. Families streamed in, prayer mats tucked under their arms, children tugging impatiently at sleeves. The ground was uneven, the path crowded, and I felt the familiar weight of being slower than the stream around me. My daughter and the younger children moved ahead, swallowed quickly into the throng. It was then that I faltered. My stick slipped slightly on the stone, and for a moment I wavered, my knees threatening to buckle. A man nearby reached instinctively to steady me, but before he could, I felt another hand at my elbow. It was my grandson. For a moment, neither of us spoke. His grip was firm, steady. He guided me carefully through the crowd, his tall frame shielding me from the jostle of others. His face was unreadable, but his presence was undeniable. He slowed his stride to match mine, his steps deliberate, unhurried. We reached the women's section, and as I lowered myself onto the mat, he released my arm with a quiet nod. No words were exchanged, but something in the silence between us shifted. Through the prayer, my mind was not entirely on the recitation. Instead, I felt the echo of his hand on my arm, the quiet acknowledgement that I was not simply too slow but still deserving of his attention, his care. Afterward, as the crowd spilled out again, I took my time gathering my things. My daughter was busy with the younger ones, and I moved at my own pace, steady and deliberate. My grandson lingered nearby, waiting. "Dottie," he said suddenly, his voice low, almost awkward. "I didn't mean," he trailed off, unable to finish. I looked at him, really looked at him, the boy who had wounded me with a careless mutter, who was now fumbling toward apology. His face carried the fragility of youth, that mixture of pride and uncertainty. "I know," I said softly. "But words stay longer than you think." He lowered his eyes, shame flickering across his face. For once, he had no quick reply, no defense. He simply nodded. And in that small nod, I saw recognition beginning to bloom. The walk back to the car was different. He walked beside me, not ahead. His pace matched mine. And though no one else noticed, it mattered deeply to me. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner, the house buzzing with noise, my grandson surprised me. He stood, awkwardly, and said, "Dottie, tell us a story from when you were young." The room fell quiet for a moment, all eyes turning to me. I hesitated, my spoon hovering above my plate. Then I smiled. "Which one?" I asked. "Any," he said, his voice steady this time. So I told them. I told them about the time I walked 5 miles to fetch water for my mother when the well in our village dried up. I told them about carrying their mother on my hip through monsoon rains, shielding her with nothing but my scarf. I told them about Eids when we had only simple clothes, but joy enough to fill the streets. As I spoke, the children leaned closer, listening, their eyes wide. My daughter watched me with quiet pride. And my grandson, he didn't look away. He listened. Really listened. When I finished, there was a silence in the room, soft and heavy with meaning. Then my grandson said, almost under his breath, "You weren't slow then." I looked at him, and for the first time since that painful morning, I smiled without ache. "I am not slow now," I said gently. "I just walk differently." The words lingered, not as a defense, but as a truth. And this time, I saw him absorb them. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt a stillness inside me. Not the stillness of invisibility, but of peace. My grandson's words had wounded me, yes, but they had also pushed me to reclaim myself. And now, slowly, the wound was closing, leaving not bitterness, but a quiet scar that reminded me of both pain and resilience. In the days that followed that Friday prayer, I found myself watching my grandson differently. Not with the hurt that had weighed on me after his careless mutter, but with something gentler, more curious. He had surprised me that day. His hand at my elbow, his awkward attempt at apology, his requested dinner for one of my stories, each of those moments had stitched a little thread back into the fabric that had been torn between us. It was not a grand repair, no dramatic reconciliation, but something subtler. Sometimes healing is not a sudden burst of light, but the steady glow of a lamp relit. I noticed, too, that he began lingering near me more often. He didn't say much, teenagers rarely do, but he was present. He sat nearby when I read, sometimes scrolling through his phone in silence, sometimes glancing up as though wanting to speak but not knowing how. When I walked to the garden, he followed at a distance, occasionally plucking a flower and twirling it idly in his hand. He still had the impatience of youth, but alongside it, I sensed the first stirrings of awareness. Perhaps he had begun to see that old age was not only frailty, but memory, resilience, and a kind of strength his young eyes could not yet fully grasp. My daughter noticed the change as well. One evening she said to me, half smiling, "Ammy, he seems softer with you now." "Maybe he's growing up." "Maybe," I replied. But in truth, I thought it was less about him growing up and more about me choosing not to shrink. It is a strange thing, the way words can shape the course of days. For weeks, his mutter, "She's too slow for the mosque," had haunted me. And yet, without it, I might have continued fading quietly into the background, content to be carried along in others' rhythms. His thoughtless remark had hurt, but it had also forced me to reclaim my own pace, to step deliberately back into the world. Pain, I realized, is sometimes a teacher disguised in cruelty. I continued my small routines of independence. I walked to the market every week, learning once more the joy of selecting my own produce, bargaining with shopkeepers, and exchanging greetings with neighbors. I visited my friend Aisha more often, our conversations becoming a lifeline of laughter and memory. I even joined a women's circle at the mosque, where older women gathered after prayers to recite and reflect together. Sitting among them, I felt a belonging I had not tasted in years. We shared verses, but also stories, of loss, of love, of children who had forgotten, and of small triumphs we carved out of the ordinary. One afternoon, as I prepared tea for my daughter and grandchildren, my grandson appeared in the kitchen doorway. He stood awkwardly, shifting from foot to foot. "Dottie," he said at last, "can I help?" I nearly dropped the spoon in my hand. Never before had he asked to help with something so mundane. I nodded, hiding my surprise. "Of course. Pour the tea, Beta." He moved carefully, filling each cup, carrying the tray with a seriousness that almost made me laugh. When he set it down before the others, my daughter looked at him in astonishment. He shrugged as though it were nothing. But I saw it, the small gesture, the quiet acknowledgement that service is not weakness, and that even the young can learn from the patience of the old. That night, as I prayed, I found myself whispering thanks. Not for being spared from hurt, but for being given the strength to rise through it. Still, the journey was not without setbacks. There were days when my body betrayed me, when pain in my knees made walking difficult, when fatigue pulled me back into the chair by the window. On those days, I felt the old ache of invisibility return, the sense of being left behind while life bustled on without me. But now, I face those days differently. I no longer let them define the whole of me. I told myself, I am slow, yes, but not absent. I am steady, yes, but not done. It was during one of those difficult weeks that my grandson surprised me again. He came into my room one evening, carrying a notebook. "Dottie," he said, "can you tell me more stories? I want to write them down." His words startled me. "Why?" I asked, genuinely curious. He hesitated, then said, "Because I don't want to forget. And maybe one day I'll tell them to my children." For a moment, I couldn't speak. My eyes filled before I could stop them, and I turned slightly so he wouldn't see. My grandson, the same boy who had once dismissed me as too slow, now wanted to carry my stories into the future. So I began. Each evening, I shared a memory. Some were simple: how I learned to cook over a wood fire, how my mother embroidered with thread so fine it seemed woven from sunlight. Others were heavier: the struggles of raising children in lean years, the grief of losing my husband too soon. He listened, sometimes scribbling quickly in his notebook, sometimes simply sitting in silence, absorbing. Through those sessions, something grew between us, not just understanding, but a bridge. He began to see me not as an old woman dragging behind, but as a whole person, a keeper of history, a survivor of trials he could scarcely imagine. And I began to see him not just as the boy who had wounded me, but as someone capable of change, of learning, of carrying my legacy forward. One evening, as we finished, he closed his notebook and said, "Dottie, you're not slow. You're steady." "That's better." The word settled inside me like a balm. Steady. Yes. That was what I had always been. Through hardship, through loss, through the relentless passage of time, I had remained steady. And now, finally, he saw it. On the next Eid, months later, when the morning came alive once again with laughter and preparation, I tied my shoes carefully, double knotting as always. My knees still ached, my pace had not quickened, but I felt lighter than I had in years. As we gathered to leave for the mosque, my grandson came to stand beside me. "Ready, Dottie?" he asked, his voice warm. Yes, I said, smiling. This time, he did not rush ahead. He walked with me, step by step, his hand steady at my elbow. The courtyard was crowded, the air buzzing, but for once I did not feel left behind. I felt present, equal, seen. When we reached the mosque, I kissed his cheek before we parted ways. He did not wipe it away this time. Instead, he smiled, just a small curve of his lips, but enough to tell me that something had truly changed. And as I laid my mat in the women's section, as I bent and rose in prayer, I felt a peace I had not known since my husband's words all those years ago, "No one is too slow for God." He had been right. I was not too slow. I was steady. And in my steadiness, I had found not only my own strength, but a way to leave a piece of it with those who would walk after me. When the prayer ended and families surged into the courtyard, I did not hurry. I moved at my own rhythm, my stick tapping against the stone, each step deliberate, sure. Around me the world rushed, as it always would. But I had learned that I did not need to match its pace to belong. I belonged because I was still walking. I belonged because I was still here. And as the sun rose higher over the mosque, warming my face, I knew this truth would carry me to the end of my days. I was never too slow. I was exactly as steady as I was meant to be.